I made it to Alesia. What you see behind me are the ruins of the city of Alesia thousands of years later, or at least part of the ruins. There's more. Actually, I got up here very quickly because a group of French people was actually kind enough to offer me a ride and gave me a ride right up here. Otherwise, I would have been lost hiking through the hills looking for this place. But there's not much left of the historic Alesia. Mostly just basement dwellings. A lot of it's been destroyed from erosion, from the cold, from freezes, from no doubt. I mean, they show all these depictions on like an iPad of what it used to look like, and it had marble columns, and it looked very Roman, if it's accurate, right? But either a lot of that was pillaged or has just disappeared into the earth throughout the ages, because now it's more just basement dwellings, kind of like the cellars left over from 2,000 years ago, which is still incredible that it's there. You know, you think about your basement that you grew up with, that 2,000 years later somebody would find it. That is pretty wild. These ruins are actually of the Gallo-Roman town built in the years after the famous Battle of Alesia. Gaul by that point was part of the Roman Empire, and so the Roman influence is clear, with everything from a theater and a forum to heated floors. Of the Gallic Alesia that Caesar put under siege, it seems little is left. Even still, it's amazing we even found this location at all. For centuries, the exact location of the Battle of Alesia was a mystery. Various places were suggested, but since the battle had taken place way back in 52 BCE, it was very difficult to be sure which location was correct. And even though this location was identified as being Alesia as early as the mid-1800s, this was not confirmed by the archaeological community until the 1990s. And I should say, for those who are unfamiliar with this Battle of Alesia that I keep referring to, Alesia was the culmination of what's called the Gallic Wars. That is Julius Caesar and the Romans' conquest of Gaul. For 9 years, Caesar and the Romans waged war on Gaul, and this Battle of Alesia was the pivotal point. The point where all the strongest Gallic tribes finally united under one leader, a man named Vercingetorix. And Vercingetorix was actually son of a man that had been king in previous generations over a good swath of Gaul, and he had been killed because he had tried to make himself king. So Vercingetorix united his people after some early victories over Caesar and the Romans, which was very rare. They then had a defeat and retreated to the hilltop fortress or hilltop town or city of Alesia, which is where I am now. Caesar then constructed a huge set of walls around the hilltop to keep the people of Alesia in, to keep Vercingetorix in, and to stop them from going out and foraging and getting help. But before Caesar was able to complete the wall, Vercingetorix sent his cavalry out to let the rest of Gaul know what was happening and to come to his rescue. Each cavalry person was supposed to go to their tribe and bring back reinforcements. Vercingetorix said every man able to bear arms should come. Now, the Romans were besieging a force actually larger than theirs. Vercingetorix had more troops than Caesar did. The numbers are debated, but Caesar says in the commentaries the Romans, I believe, this is from the top of my head, had about 55,000 troops, and that Vercingetorix had 80,000 inside of Alesia. Well, the Gauls that Vercingetorix sent his messengers to then raised additional troops, and they come with, and this is where the numbers get real debatable, Caesar says, I think anywhere from 200 to 300 some thousand, which would make him outnumbered 4 or 5 to 1. Those numbers I'm not as confident on, but I'll put a little bubble that says the correct number there. Caesar gets word that these guys are on their way, so he builds a second wall. I mean, you think about what are his options there. He could have retreated, he could have left the siege, left Vercingetorix, he could have moved to a different location and fought them on more advantageous ground. He did not have to keep the siege going. Instead, he decides to proceed with the siege and yet be besieged at the same time. He's going to be besieging Alesia while this massive Gallic army comes and besieges him. And what he does is he builds a second wall around the hilltop town of Alesia. And that second wall is to keep out the now relief force that's come now to relieve the people of Alesia from Caesar. So a number of battles happen at different points. The Gauls are attacking from within Alesia on Caesar's walls that are keeping them in, and the Gauls are attacking from the outside, from the wall against the walls that are keeping the relief force out, and trying to coordinate their attacks as best they could, because they couldn't speak to each other. There's no way to communicate. That's why Caesar had built those walls, was to cut them off. Eventually, this all culminated in the Gauls finding a weak point in the Roman lines and focusing all of their efforts on this weak point. And the Roman lines were stretched thin. I mean, they were outnumbered, whether it's 2-1, 3-1, 4-1, 5-1, who knows what the actual numbers are. But they were outnumbered significantly, and they had to man this entire circumference of both these walls. So the Romans were spread thin, and in the final key moment, Caesar grabs reinforcements from other parts of the wall. Cavalry he orders to find a way out of the wall to go around the wall and come and hit the Gauls from behind from where they're attacking it at the Roman weak point. Caesar says in the commentaries that his troops saw his scarlet cloak flying behind him, kind of his cape, his superhero cape, which he always wore as a general, and they cheered, and the Gauls cheered, more of a jeer against him than a cheer, and the fighting renewed, and his presence boosted the morale of the flagging troops there, because they had been pushed back beyond the first Roman wall. And then the reinforcements with Caesar jump in, and then finally the cavalry comes from behind that Caesar had sent, and they smash the Gallic attack force to bits, and they go running, and the rest is history. That was the last gasp of Gallic freedom. There would be more battles after that, but none of them as significant as Alesia. Of course, it was Vercingetorix and the Gauls that spent their time inside Alesia during the siege. Caesar and the Romans, on the other hand, occupied the hilly terrain surrounding the hilltop town of Alesia. The Romans spent countless hours constructing their two-ring walls and accompanying fortifications that they used to both encircle Vercingetorix and keep out the Gallic relief force. So let's take a break from Alesia itself for a moment to get a closer look at the fortifications Caesar and the Romans were so busy building. At the museum that they have here at Alesia, they have a reconstruction of the actual fortifications that Caesar would have built around Alesia to keep in the Gauls and Vercingetorix. It's really incredible the amount of detail that they have. Take a look at this behind me. You can see the tower actually behind me, but if we pan this way, you can see all the towers, Roman tents inside between the two sets of walls, the circumvallation, and then this one here. And they actually have built outside the walls, if we go this way, all of the ditches and fortifications that Caesar would have had to keep the Gauls in. And filled with water, which some of them actually were. Caesar even mentions that in the commentaries. So if we look here, imagine charging this. Let me turn for you here. So they have all the traps here that Caesar says him and his legionaries built, filled with spikes that would impale your legs as you charged. I apologize for the wind. And if you get past those, which some of the attacks were at night, so you couldn't always see those traps, you have ditches here filled with water. All the while you're trying to get across that, Roman troops are showering stones and arrows and spears from these towers down upon you. So then if you finally get past all of that, all while being hit with stones and arrows and spears, you have to climb this earthen hill here, get over the wood fence built there, while Romans are stabbing at you with swords and spears. An absolute gauntlet. They even have reconstructions of catapults, which you can see behind me by that one tent. Back, that way. Sorry, that way. And that's something I should mention, is it wasn't just arrows and spears and stones being thrown at the Gallic attackers. It was actually ballista too. I mean, they had scorpions, they had what amounts to giant crossbows and maybe catapults too, shooting large bolts and throwing stones very accurately at the Gauls. It would have been very intimidating. If we come over to this side, we see the other side of the fortifications. The wall looks very similar, but here you'll notice more traps that weren't on the other side, a bunch of sharpened branches sticking out of the ground, and I don't know if you can see here, I'll zoom in, but a number of spikes sticking out of the ground. I think Caesar's troops called them lilies. And then if we keep walking this way, we can see two large ditches filled with water. Now Caesar, I think, only had one ditch filled with water and the other one not filled with water, but I guess they've had some rain here recently, so here they are both filled with water. But water or not, it would have been a very difficult task to get past these fortifications. And as we know from history and from Caesar's commentaries, the Gauls were not able to do it. They pushed the Romans to the absolute limit in the Battle of Alesia on both sides, because the Gauls were attacking from inside Alesia and outside Alesia, both armies outnumbering the Romans, and they were unable to take down the Roman defenses, which Caesar and his soldiers spent huge amounts of time and huge amounts of effort constructing. Alesia was really a desperate siege, especially for the Gauls. For those outside and those inside, it was a fight for their survival, and they realized it. And they struggled mightily to try to take down Caesar and to take down the Romans. But as we know from history, it's not so easy to take down the Romans. They are very good at conquering and very good at subjugating foreign peoples. But I'll be honest, Alesia seems like a miserable place to live, because we're on a hilltop here. I don't know if you can see this. It's kind of a hilltop surrounded by other hills. And it is cold and it is windy in late October. I'm here Halloween weekend, what is it, the 28th or 29th? And it's cold and it's windy, and this is where the village would have been all the time. It doesn't seem like a cozy place to live to me. Thinking back to the time of Caesar and the siege of Alesia, this was really a location of immense suffering. Caesar had barricaded Vercingetorix and his, depends on what source you read, but maybe 80,000 men into Alesia. And the poor tribespeople that lived in the town had no choice but to accept them and to become part of the siege. And Caesar then proceeded to starve them out when he realized that he wasn't going to be able to storm Alesia. And the starvation and the suffering got so bad that Vercingetorix actually kicked out the inhabitants, the original inhabitants, at least the ones that couldn't fight, from the town. The useless mouths, as they're called. So it forced out all the women and all the children and all the elderly and sent them towards Caesar's lines, thinking that they would then become Caesar's burden and that he would have to feed them and take care of them, and it would hurt his supplies, which he didn't have that many either, because there just was only so much terrain that they could. Typically an army, if they're moving, can feed itself on the move, because there's always new ground with new food. But if you're sitting in one place, then eventually you deplete all your food stocks. Let's take a break here. But Caesar refused to allow these people through his lines, refused to take care of them, didn't attack them, didn't kill them, but wasn't going to fall for Vercingetorix's trap either, or his trick. And so these poor people languished between Roman and Gallic lines, and you got to think their relatives, who were the warriors still in Alesia, had to sit there and watch them slowly die of hunger. At one point during the siege of Alesia, one of Vercingetorix's lieutenants actually suggests that the Gauls should take all of the useless mouths, the people that can't fight, the women, the children, the elderly, the cripples, anyone like this, and eat them. That way, not only would they be not eating the very limited food supplies that Vercingetorix had, but they would be feeding the army and making them strong. And he actually cited historical evidence or historical stories that different Gallic tribes had done this before. Of course, in the end, it never came to that. They ended up forcing the people to leave the city of Alesia rather than eating them. Now, after the final battle of Alesia, after the Romans had smashed the Gallic relief force and sent it running, and a while later chased it down and killed a number more of them, Vercingetorix went to the people of Alesia, or the warriors that were left, and he said basically that he understood the writing was on the wall, he was defeated, and he offered to do whatever they saw fit. If they wanted to surrender him alive, he would do that. If they wanted to kill him, that was fine too. If they wanted to keep on fighting, I don't think that was really an option on the table, but perhaps he would have done that. But everyone wanted to surrender, and they gave up Vercingetorix alive to Caesar. And this is where there's differing accounts, competing accounts about what happened. Caesar just says that Vercingetorix came and laid down his weapon and was hauled away in chains. You get a different account from Plutarch and some other guys like that. Plutarch says that Vercingetorix put on his finest armor, came down to the Roman camp, startled the Roman soldiers because they were so surprised as to he was a large guy, right? A large, scary-looking Gallic guy, and suddenly he appears by the Roman lines and it startles the Roman soldiers, and it's Vercingetorix, and he's in all of his finest armor, and I think it's Cassius Dio, or at least one of the ancient accounts, has him riding his horse in a circle around Caesar as Caesar sits on kind of a podium before dismounting and putting his weapons down at Caesar's feet and sitting silently there, waiting to be taken away. Who knows what the exact account is or what exactly happened, but we do know that Vercingetorix surrendered and was then held as a prisoner of Caesar's, and remained so for a number of years before being strangled at the end of a triumph, which was a Roman tradition, was to have the barbarian king march in the triumph of, it's like a parade basically in Rome, of the triumphing general that had won the war, and at the end he is ritually strangled to death. The Romans were brutal. Now, originally, and I apologize for the wind and the microphone and my hair is going crazy, but originally I was hoping to actually hike all around this hill of Alesia and find, the different ditches that maybe Caesar had dug, and just to explore the area and see, where Caesar would have dug these forts and how the terrain looked. But as you can see behind me, they fence it off, so I'm kind of a prisoner here in Alesia, much like Vercingetorix 2,000 years ago. I have been imprisoned in Alesia, so they're not letting me go explore it. I'm still gonna try. I'm gonna leave Alesia now and see if I can just go wander through these farm fields. I don't want to get shot by some farmer, but gotta risk it for the biscuit, I guess. Let's give it a shot. And we still gotta find the Vercingetorix statue. On my way to see the Vercingetorix statue, and gotta hurry a little bit because there's supposed to be rain coming in the forecast. And I'm not trying to get caught outside in the rain with a few miles to walk back to the village with all this camera equipment I have. So it's gonna move on, plus nighttime's coming and I have a train to catch. We'll see the Vercingetorix statue and try to do some hiking around this area to see if we can find some more of the, or just kind of see more of the terrain that Caesar would have built his forts on. After a little bit of hiking through some beautiful French countryside, I found what I was looking for. The statue of the man himself, the leader of the last great Gallic rebellion against Julius Caesar, Vercingetorix, still watching over the area surrounding Alesia all these millennia later. Behind me you see the famous statue to Vercingetorix built in the 1800s. It was actually built by Napoleon III. I believe he was the nephew of Napoleon Bonaparte, the famous Napoleon. Found himself Emperor of the French, his nephew, Napoleon III. And Napoleon III is actually the one who started all these excavations of Alesia. Nobody knew where the site was. It was a mystery. And he's the one, or, with help from many people, I'm sure, who found this site, identified it as a potential possibility for Alesia, and started excavations, and found out that it was indeed Alesia, and that a lot of the things that they found matched up with what Caesar said. And also, fun fact, Vercingetorix, who, you can see the statue right there, the statue of Vercingetorix's face is modeled on that of Napoleon III. His idea in renovating Alesia, not renovating, but uncovering Alesia, was to create a historic event, or to uncover a historic event that the French people could look at and be united by, where they were united under one man, Vercingetorix, whose father had been king of France. Sorry, the wind's buffeting me here. And it could act as a symbol of national unity. And so, if in case the symbolism was lost, he made sure that Vercingetorix's face was modeled on his own, which is laughable, but this is history. And so I said goodbye to Vercingetorix, and decided to get off the beaten path and do some wandering in the terrain around Alesia, where Caesar and the Romans had built their fortifications. My goal was to see if I could find the weak point in Caesar's lines where the climax of the battle had taken place. Alright, we've really gone off the beaten track now. I'm trying to find some of the areas that Caesar built his forts in. So I'm hiking down from the Vercingetorix statue through the woods on the side of the Alesia hill. Let me turn the camera around for you. Alright, looks like we're on some kind of farmer's land here. But I think we're still going the right way. I think we're headed towards the weak point in Caesar's lines. I can't promise you. There's no exact maps. But we'll see if this farm fence stops us or if we can find a way around it. Alright, I found my way through the barbed wire fence. You can see the farm barbed wire fence right there. And we are on our way. I can't believe it, but I found it. That hill behind me, you see, is the weak point in Caesar's lines. This is where the culmination of the siege of Alesia and of the entire Gallic Wars happened. Let me give you a better view of that hill. It's actually a pretty large hill, and for that reason, Caesar did not build his wall all the way around the hill. His wall did not encompass this hill. In fact, it stopped at part of the way up the hill, and he built a few additional walls to make it more difficult for the Gauls. And the Gauls, after some initial unsuccessful attempts to storm Caesar's fortifications head-on, decided to get some local scouts, and the local scouts found this location. They then planned a secret attack of this wall with a number of distracting attacks from both inside Alesia and outside Alesia at the same time. And this is where the Gauls pressed the Romans the hardest. And this is where the culmination of the whole siege of Alesia happened. It got so bad for the Romans that the Gauls actually came over the wall. And it wasn't until Caesar showed up, scarlet cape flapping in the wind, his troops cheer him, the Gauls jeer him, he sends in reinforcements and a cavalry force that he ordered to go out of the fortifications around the Gauls and to flank them on that hill from behind, hit them in the flank or hit them from behind, and that's what basically shattered the Gallic attack and saved the day for the Romans. But this hill is the weak point in the Roman lines. This is where it all happened, and this is where the fate of Gaul was decided. But of course, it wasn't good enough just to see this historic site from a distance. I needed to see it up close and personal. So I kept hiking toward the base of that hill, and pretty soon, I was very, very far from the Vercingetorix statue. Now, Caesar in his Gallic War commentaries describes the hill that Alesia was perched on as being flanked on two sides by rivers. You can see the river on the north side of Alesia on this map as it passes Alesia, then flows by the base of another hill where the circle is on this map. That circle depicts where the weak point in Caesar's lines is supposed to have been. So, as I hiked toward the base of the hill, I was on the lookout for a river. Eventually, after crossing the railroad tracks and walking through a small village, I found a trail that led toward the hill we just saw from a distance. And lo and behold, What did I see there but a small river intersecting my path? Just like on the maps I had seen, and just like Caesar's description. So I followed the river for a little ways until I found a crossing point. And once I crossed, sure enough, there was the hill we had just been looking at from a distance. I had found the weak point in Caesar's lines. Alright, I'm going to speak quietly here because I may be trespassing. Behind me is the base of the hill that we were just looking at, the one where the culmination of the siege of Alesia happened. You can even see the river here, which I just showed you before, which helped to make this area so tough for Caesar to wall up. This area is very tranquil right now, very peaceful, but 2,000 years ago, it was a bloodbath, absolute carnage in the climax of the Battle of Alesia.